Thank you very much. I normally like to start with low expectations, but I'll take it. So I want to talk to you today about the power of narrative. And I've been given 12 minutes, so I was going to just cover 90 years of agriculture, but I'm going to cover 10,000 because I have a full 12 minutes. So the stories we tell determine the future that we get. Unfortunately, the stories we're telling today about agriculture are failing us. They are dividing us. And so I want to talk to you about two stories. I want to talk to you first about the story that we hear every day in the media. And it sounds something like this. 40% of all the land on earth that could be used for agriculture is being used for agriculture today. The amount of cropland is the size of South America. The amount of pasture land the size of Africa. There's nothing more important than agriculture. And it's true. But also, if we were to talk about water, 70% of all the fresh water on earth used by man goes to agriculture. This is the Colorado River, the 5th largest river in America, no longer flows to the sea. And that's because of agricultural withdrawals. If we were to talk about climate change, 10 to 15% of all greenhouse gases come from agriculture. Another 10 to 15% from deforestation, 80% of which is caused by agriculture. It's almost as much as energy, and it's more than anything else. Again, these are the stories that we hear. But it's also just not enough of a challenge because we have 800 million people who will go to bed hungry today. So we're not even feeding the people we have, and we have all of these challenges. And the challenge is just going to get worse because we're going from 8 to 9.5 billion people on the planet. Things are hard, and things are going to get worse. That's the story that we hear. And we can't do and solve any of these problems unless we work together. You may have noticed my accent. There is a little bit of polarization and division in the world today. You may not have heard that here. But that's a huge problem because we can't solve big problems if we don't work together, and it's never been harder to work together. That is also a problem. So the challenge we have is not that we don't have solutions, but that science tells us what we can do, but it's the public that tells us what we should do. And what they tell us that we should do is based on the stories they hear. And today, the story they hear are that things are bad, and they're going to get worse, and that we're going to have to sacrifice, and the future will be worse than the past that we've experienced. And when people talk about solutions, they often talk about problems and solutions. This is how companies talk about it and governments talk about it. And people believe the problems when we explain it to them. They just don't believe the solutions because they think they're trying to sell them something. And that's because we lack trust. If people don't trust you, they don't believe your solutions. If you try to explain your science, if people don't trust you, they don't want to listen to your science. And if people do trust you, they don't need to hear your science. And so science comes after trust, and we need trust. And so the problem is that a story of things are bad and getting worse leads to apathy. It does not lead to action. We need a story that leads to action. We need a new narrative. So what's missing from this story? In a simple sense, it's really just historical context, which is what this conference is all about. That's what's missing from almost every story we hear about agriculture, is historical context. And I want to give you an example of what that looks like in practice. So CO2 emissions in the UK, about 5.5 tons per person. You might not know, but it's a terrible number. It's higher than the global average. It's the sort of thing that makes young people despair for their future. It's also a 150-year low. Does that knowledge not make you feel differently about the problem? That maybe we can tackle this, that maybe we can do it. CO2 emissions in the UK, 40% below 1990 levels, and GDP 40% higher. We can have a better future and a more sustainable future at the same time. Stories can inspire us to do better, or they can make us sit down and cover our heads with a blanket. So what about agriculture? So I'm not going to go back 10,000 years, but I will go back 200 years. And if we go back 200 years, the world was poor and hungry, and people did not live very long. But over time, because of better health and nutrition, we've dramatically reduced childhood mortality everywhere in the world, and people lived longer, and they lived healthier lives. And by the time we get to the present, the poorest and hungriest country on the planet is both healthier and wealthier than the wealthiest planet 200 years ago. That is a good news story. It is an amazing story, and it is a story of agriculture because it is a story of better nutrition and food. But we just don't talk about these stories very often. We often talk about things are bad and they're getting worse. But the reality is that things are not bad and getting worse. They are good and getting better, but not fast enough. That is a very different story. How we communicate matters. How we communicate determines if people work with us to solve problems or they actively work against us to make solutions more difficult. That is part of the challenge we have. So I've talked about the past, I've talked about the present, so now I want to talk a little bit about the future. And how do most people think about the future? And I think most people, when they think about the future, they ask two questions. They ask, what do I think will happen? And what should I do about it? Now, those are normal things to ask. This is how governments think about the future, and companies think about the future, and people think about the future. This is really just strategic planning. And strategic planning is about preparing for the place that you expect to go. It's about de-risking the future. It's about making the future less bad. Another way, though, to think about the future is strategic foresight. And I spent a few years working as a food futurist, and a futurist is a title that you give yourself to charge more as a consultant. For the young people in the audience, I highly recommend it. For those who are thinking of hiring me, I'm just kidding, of course it's totally worth the money. But we think about the future in a different way. And so we use this nifty futures cone. And in the middle of that cone is the probable future. It's the most likely future. It's the future that strategic planning is preparing you for. But the real question is our best future, is an amazing future, the future that's most likely? I think not. The best future is someplace else. So the things we do tomorrow to get to our best future are fundamentally different than the things we do tomorrow to prepare for the worst. We need to prepare for the future we want. We need to stop preparing for the future we expect, and we need to start creating the future that we want. We have an amazing future. And so what I want to think about is why now matters, why this particular moment in time is so critically important. So we already talked about the next 50 years, or 25 years, and that's where most people stop thinking about the future after 2050. It just disappears. But if we think beyond 2050, by the end of this century, population will already be declining. The population of Europe will be 10% smaller than it is today. The population of China will be 50% what it is today. The world is a very, very different place in 2050. And so the challenges we have is not to produce more and more food forever. It's to get to 2050 without screwing things up. Because every day between now and 2050, it gets harder to feed the world. But every day after 2050, it could get easier to feed the world if we haven't cut down our forests and drained our rivers, our lakes, and our aquifers. We could take all the productivity gains of agriculture and use them to reduce the footprint of agriculture because we don't need dramatically more food. We have this enormous opportunity, but it requires us to get there without having screwed things up. So that's where we are today. And so as we think about the next 24 hours in this conference, what I want us to do is to understand why now matters. So one of the thoughts I want to leave you with is the next 25 years are not just the most important 25 years in the 10,000-year history of agriculture, and they're the most important 25 years there will ever be in the history of agriculture. And that's why this moment is so important. And that's why this conversation is so critical. And that's why the work that you do is so essential. But it's the public that tells us what we should do. And today, our stories are failing us. The public is not demanding the kinds of solutions that we could create. But what if the stories we told inspired people? What if the stories we told made people believe in a better future? What if the stories we told caused everybody to get up every morning to make the world a better place because they believed in a better future? Imagine what the world could be with a better story. If people they believed and saw themselves in solutions, not in sacrifices. So what I'd like you to do when you leave here is don't ask people to sacrifice for the future. Invite them to embrace it. Because the stories we tell determine the future that we get. And it all depends on what you do today. Thank you.